I wanted to begin this afternoon with a little slide presentation because I work on the premise that most people have no idea who Joseph Chomsky was. And this will give you a visual image in your head so that when Bob and I talk later, you'll have more of a sense of who we're talking about. So these are Chomsky's years. He was born in 1896 and lived virtually the entire 20th century. His parents, who were born in the 1860s, were both very aristocratic and noble in birth. His mother was a Habsburg princess, and his father was a Polish count. To give you an idea of the world in which he was born, Chomsky's father, who was a Polish count, did not learn Polish until he went to university. So they spoke French at home, they spoke German. Chomsky's mother was Austrian, spoke German mostly. Polish was not automatically understood to be a nationality that Chomsky would undertake. This is the home in which he grew up, which was an estate in what's now Belarus. Here he is with his mother. And here, this is an indication of the kind of life of privilege that his childhood was, full of French tutors and German nannies and Italian music teachers.
They could be quadruplets.
They all looked alike. And Chomsky had 5 sisters. These are 2 of them, and his brother's in the picture as well. They were all over 6 feet tall. 2 of his sisters were over 6'4", and none of his sisters was ever able to wear wooden shoes because they never made them in their size. But they did look enormously alike. And well, I can get into stories, so I'm just going to go through this story. When Chomsky was 6, his mother died, giving birth to her 8th child. The child also died. So that was a big sea change in his life emotionally. When he was 13, he and his younger brother were sent to St. Petersburg to study Russian for the Russian baccalaureate, because the family property was in the Russian part of the division of Poland. Poland was partitioned by 3 empires: the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Prussian Empire, and the Tsarist Russian Empire. His family estates and fortune were in the Russian part. And in order for him to inherit and carry on all of that, he had to speak Russian fluently. On the estate where he grew up, only the servants in the house spoke Russian, so he didn't have fluency. So he and his brother were sent by their father to be students in the home of a tutor, and they spent many years there preparing for these exams. This is he and his sister, Marina, who was a very close relationship. They spent most of their lives together, very near one another. And here he is in 1917 as a cadet. His father saw what was coming. The First World War erupted in 1914, of course, right after Chomsky arrived in Petersburg. And by 1917, things had gotten so desperate that the Tsars were trying to get any young men to go to the front. So their father put them in an elite boarding school that was a military officer training school to keep them from going to the front. In 1917, the Russian Revolution happened. So he and his brother lived through the Russian Revolution both in February and October of that year, which was very devastating for him. But he had already been convinced by Tolstoy that he was a pacifist. So he wanted to serve his country, but he also didn't want to kill. So after the initial ordination, I don't know what the word exactly is, when you become an officer, he became an officer through this school, and after his first foray against the German troops, he said he could never kill, and he essentially said he needed to leave the military. And almost anybody else, that would be considered treasonous, and you could be shot as a traitor for not filling out your term as a military officer. But because of class distinctions and his being a count and all of that, it was overlooked. And immediately when he was released, he went into Petersburg and created a shelter to help people deal with the trauma. Then in 1918, he went back to Poland. He enrolled in the School of Fine Arts in Krakow. You can see here how tall he is compared to everybody else in the class. And in 1919, this is something, part of my research that I learned, I had no idea that there was a war between Soviet Russia and Poland. Russia was attempting essentially to get to Germany, to take advantage of the ruin of Germany from the end of the First World War, to convert the workers of Germany to communism. Well, the way they could get to Germany was to go across Poland, and Poland wasn't going to let them just use them as a bridge. So they fought, and it looked very bad for the Poles until one event happened in which one of the generals decided to act on his own reconnaissance rather than taking orders from his superiors, and they opened up part of the Soviet army was split, and the Poles got in, and they essentially divided, and the Soviets had to retreat, and the Soviets lost this confrontation with the Poles. The general who tried to do things his way was named Stalin. So this explains a lot about his future relationship with Poland, because he was humiliated by this experience. But before he went into this, Chapsky again was conflicted. He wanted to support his country, but he didn't want to kill, so he became a non-combatant officer. And his instructor in the camp before going to fight the Soviets was an observer from the French army named Charles de Gaulle. This was he, they were both in their 20s, and they became friends. So after that war, Chapsky came back to Poland. He went to the Academy of Fine Arts, this time in Warsaw, and in Krakow. And this time he studied for 2 years as a painter, and he began to realize very soon that the curriculum was not to his taste. In Poland doesn't have a great history of visual arts, and the painters that do work there do primarily religious and historical themes. Chapsky had 2 years of that was enough for him, and he wanted to be in Paris where the real action was. So he and 12 of his fellow Polish art students raised money for them to all go to Paris. They had a ball, they sold tickets, they did whatever they needed to do, and they raised enough money to go to Paris for 6 weeks. And they stayed 7 years. These are some of the people that Chapsky befriended in those years in the 20s in Paris. This is the roaring 20s. Remember, everybody wanted to be in Paris at the time. On the left is a painting by Degas. The little boy that's shown here is at that point a young man named Daniel Alevi, whose uncle wrote the libretto for Carmen. This is the Bohemian world that Chapsky was introduced to. It was very refined, cultured painters, a direct connection to the likes of Degas. It was very unusual for a Pole to come to Paris and have these kinds of connections. Gertrude Stein bought a painting of Chapsky's while he was in Paris in the 20s. Underneath Gertrude Stein is André Malraux. Who wouldn't like to be underneath Gertrude Stein? He was an enormous influence on art criticism, on art history. He eventually became de Gaulle's Minister of Culture. And to his right is Lily de Pastelé, who I used as an example of a French noblewoman who was completely dedicated to supporting the arts. And during the Second World War, she was her estate in Provence became a refuge for Jewish artists. So this gives you an example of the kind of people that Chapsky was involved in, and it informed his life to the extent that after the war, he had connections in France with the left because he was interested in the Bohemian scene. He knew the literary culture. He knew the critical writers. His base was in the center with de Gaulle and Malraux, and on the right he knew all of the archbishops and the priests because he was very devout as a Catholic, and he knew he was a count, so he covered the whole spectrum. And because he had no personal sense of power, he had no interest in personal power, everybody respected him as a man who could help make things happen by creating bridges between groups that ordinarily don't talk. This is after his time in Paris, back home with the family. He's in the upper right-hand corner with his sister Marinia. And this is in the 30s, he's back in Poland painting. And this was a great time for him. It was a time in which he brought he nurtured the seed of French painting and brought forth French painting into the Polish art world. This is an example of something. You can see Bonnard, you can see Fauvism, you can see the influence on him. This is not like anything that had previously been done in Paris, in Poland. A self-portrait from 1937. And here he is in September 1939. Germany has just invaded Poland on the 1st, and on the 16th of September, Russia invaded Poland. So Chapsky, this is on his way to find his unit, his cavalry unit. He's reporting to war once again. He'd been through the First World War, been through the Polish-Soviet War. Here he is as a reserve officer in the Second World War. And 3 weeks later, he became a prisoner. He was in a battle near the city of Lvov, and he was captured by the Germans, but he was made a prisoner of the Soviets. The Red Army took him away, along with all the other officers, and it wasn't known at that time. There was still a secret between Hitler and Stalin that they had divided Poland between them in the weeks before the invasion of Poland. The understanding was that the Germans would take the rank-and-file Polish soldiers and take them as slave labor, and that the Soviets would take the officer class and execute them. So between the 5th of April 1940, this is now several months after he's made prisoner, between April 5th, 1940 and May 5th, 1940, the Red Army in their camps, prison camps were overseen by what became the KGB. It was called the NKVD in those days. These men were made into political prisoners as opposed to military ones, so that because the Soviet Union never declared war on Poland, these men were treated as criminals rather than as soldiers. So between those days, the 5th of April and the 5th of May, 22,000 officers were executed by the Soviets, each with a single bullet to the back of the head, in 3 separate locations. So every night, about 250 men were shot. Their bodies were taken to mass graves that had been dug that day. They were stacked 12 deep and then covered over, and trees were planted on top of them. So in 30 days, 22,000 men were killed this way. These are their dog tags, these are their glasses, these are the pipes that they had made for themselves in prison. The Soviets buried them with their coats on, with all their identification, with all of their personal effects, and just walked away. Chapsky was in another camp. He was one of 395 men who, for some reason that we don't know to this day, was spared this fate. He was in a camp with these other men, and every night they, after a long day in the freezing weather, with terrible nutrition, there was no food for them really, and there was an enormous amount of vermin in their beds, so they were always covered with lice. Horrible situation. These men, the last thing they thought of themselves as was survivors. In point of fact, they didn't know it. But every night, somebody would speak among them, would speak about something that had meaning to them, and this would be like a morale boost. Every night somebody would talk about something. They did not speak about anything nationalistic or anything Polish, because they knew there would be division among them. So they spoke about other things. And Chapsky began speaking about the history of French painting. He was a painter. And as he was putting those talks together, he realized he should talk about Proust, because most of the men there had not read Proust. He had read Proust in the 20s, one volume after another as they became available. He read them in French. He had no books whatsoever in this prison camp in Soviet Russia, and he had to remember what he had read, which is essentially the essence of Proust, is to remember. And night after night, like Scheherazade, he would tell the story of Proust in French to a group of Polish officers. And we are lucky in that after he gave these series of talks, he gave them in an abbreviated version to two of his fellow officers who wrote down what he said. So these are the transcripts that I translated, and this is the introduction I made to Chapsky. I guess this can go on, but it was a case where in 1941, Hitler and Stalin had been allies, but in June 41, Hitler attacked Stalin, and so the Germans invaded Soviet Russia, the Soviet Union. All the Polish prisoners who were left were liberated and became part of the Polish army to fight the common enemy of Hitler. So this is the trip, essentially, of Chapsky's years between 1939 and 1945. He left Warsaw. He went to battle near Lvov. He was taken by camp to camp at Starobielsk. Then all of those men that he'd been in camp with in Starobielsk were killed. He had been taken away and sent to Gryazovets. This is where the camp was, the survivors were. When the Germans attacked the Soviets, they formed the camp at that place. They formed the army, the Polish army, at Gryazovets. And then they made this trip over the years to Tashkent, all the way down in Kazakhstan, and then across. They left Soviet Russia because Stalin could no longer feed this army. And they made a deal with the British that the British would take care of this Polish army. And they essentially made their way across the entire Middle East in various stages and various manners of transportation. And essentially these were men who had been prisoners, who had been fed nothing. They were in no condition to fight. And Stalin essentially agreed to let them create a Polish army with the idea that he would just send it to the front and they would all be destroyed. But they, after 2 years, gained force, gained strength, and with the British help, they became an army. They went to the Middle East and they went to Cairo. And from Cairo, they took a boat across the Mediterranean to Italy, and they joined the army, the Allied army in Italy, and they fought in their first battle. They fought the Battle of Monte Cassino, which opened the road to Rome. It was the first European capital that was liberated. Here's Chapsky in Egypt in 1943. And throughout this entire episode, throughout this entire journey, he kept illustrated journals. There are now 295 journals of his in a medieval library in Krakow. They're beautiful, beautiful books, and an amazing document. Chapsky was named by the general of the new Polish army to be the chief minister of information and propaganda. Here he is with General Anders, who was the head of the army, who had once been in love with one of Chapsky's sisters, but because he was not of the same class, he could not marry her. So Chapsky was Anders' social superior, but military inferior. And this, and anybody else, could have been a real source of difficulty, but Chapsky had no interest at all in identifying himself as an aristocrat. He was a true bohemian that way. And on this trip in the Middle East, he created with a bunch of other men the idea of a journal that would create Polish awareness of Polish culture that was not communist, because they could already see that it was clear that the Soviet state was going to take over Poland. So in 1947 in Paris, they made their first issue of this magazine called Kultura, which was for from 1947 until 2000, over 600 issues of this magazine. And it attempted to reach across European culture. So you'll see Valery here, you see Lorca, you see Corte, you see all of these people who form what's now known as the anti-communist left. This was their base outside of Paris in a house called Maison Lafitte. From 1945 essentially until he died in 1993, this is where Chomsky lived. In the 50s he began to paint again. And so that's really the end of his Odyssey. He stayed in Paris for the rest of his life and painted. Here he is with the poet Zbigniew Herbert on their first meeting. Herbert, like many young Polish literary artists and painters, would come to Paris to meet Chomsky. He had such a powerful reputation as a man of integrity and a man who knew how to live the life of an artist. Here he is, these are for Bob. This is pictures of him with Czesław Miłosz. They were close friends. Chomsky was something of a mentor to Miłosz. He introduced Miłosz to the work of Simone Weil, and we will talk about this later. I hope. So these now just have some paintings of his to show you. These are give you an idea of his range as a painter. Little plug while I'm doing this. I'm also making a monograph of his book that will come out in September, and all of these images will be part of that large art book. This is the first Chomsky painting I ever saw, and it convinced me, against my initial skepticism about him as a painter, that he really was a fine painter, which is not shown in the images that I had seen online or seeing like in this occasion. It really is, the relationship of his actual work being in front of a painting of his it's crucial that you see the painting, not just the reproduction of it. Here he is in front of this painting. This is his youngest sister, Ruja. Self-portrait from 1958. And his self-portrait without the head, which was very revealing of who he really was. And also, anybody over 6 feet knows what it's like to go into a public bathroom. And this is a late, great self-portrait in which he shows himself by his knees and his feet in a room full of paintings which are not necessarily his, but just an homage to the sacred space that art creates. This is the room at the back of the house where he lived in Maison Lafitte for 50 years. You can see this is his position on the bed. It was his bedroom, it was his painting studio, it was his library, it was his reception room for visitors. And above his head was a low shelf on which he kept his diaries. And every morning he would reach up for his diary and spend an hour in bed writing. You can see the way the wall behind his head is worn. And he died in 1993 listening to Chopin at the age of 96.
After the collapse of the Soviet.
After the collapse. He lived long enough so that part of the story that I didn't say about the execution of the Polish officers is that the Soviets always claimed that the Nazis had done it. And in 1943, they accused the Nazis of perpetrating this propaganda. So from 1943 until 1990, the official Soviet line was that the Germans had killed these men. And Chapsky was the single figure who insisted that it was the Soviets. So when communism fell and the Soviet archives were opened, Chapsky's position was validated, and he got to at least understand that the Soviet state officially had to acknowledge this hideous act. Thank you.
It's the most incredible story, yes. And when you set out, you knew none of this.
That's right.
So how did you get onto it in the first place?
Well, I wrote a book 10 years ago about the paintings in Proust. And 6.5 years ago, a friend of mine, and of several people in this room, sent to me from Paris a copy of another book about Proust written by another painter. And it was Chapsky's lectures on Proust that he had given in the Soviet camp. And one day, it came in the mail, and as I say at the very beginning of my book, the next day I was hooked. I was so compelled, I found it so compelling and so interesting, not so much about what he said about Proust, but about who this guy was in the Soviet camp, to be giving lectures in French about Proust. I needed to know more about it, and I decided that I could do the translation relatively easily because it wasn't that big a book, and I thought it would be fun to do, and I thought it would add to the scholarship about Proust. And as I was doing the translation, I thought, I need to know more.
So what was the next step?
The next step was to find out if I wanted if I wanted to invest the next few years writing about somebody I didn't know anything about. One of the first things I had to determine was Chapsky's relationship to Jews, because I grew up in a home where the word Pole and the word anti-Semite were essentially the same thing. And as soon as I was able to establish that this was not the case, I found him more interesting. When I found that he was a painter and I found some of his paintings online, I thought, these are interesting, but I really need to see them. So the next step was to go to Europe and to find the paintings.
Where did you go first?
Well, I went first to Paris, which is when I said, this is the first painting I've seen. I saw it in the apartment of a man who's a Polish man, many Poles living in Poland, many Poles living in exile, who were still there in the 21st century. And he had this one painting on his wall. And it was like a litmus test, because who was I to come and write about Chapsky? He knew this man very well, knew him intimately, didn't want his reputation to be enhanced if it was going to be for a political or some kind of agenda. And when he saw me looking at that painting, he knew that I had something to say, because I don't speak Polish, and that was why I was very unsure about whether I would be able to do this work, because I knew if I spent 3 years learning Polish, I would probably lose steam. But if I could start right away writing about the paintings, I wouldn't. And he said to me, don't worry about the language, because the language you do speak with Chapsky is the language of painting. And that was the real trigger.
Eric said that he was working on a book on Proust. In case any of you don't know, this is the book, Paintings in Proust, a visual companion to In Search of Lost Time. So this is reproduces every single painting in the novels that you might still know as remembrance of things past, reproduced with translations of the passage in which they referred to. It's about the most delicious book you could imagine, in case you're thinking about Christmas presents and supporting the passage. So I knew some of this story because of my years of translating the poems of my neighbor Czesław Miłosz, and I knew that room where you saw in Maison Lafitte, where you saw Chomsky lying, when in 1950 Miłosz defected, wrote a short article that was published in Chomsky's magazine, the article famous in Poland with the one-word title, Nay, No, saying, I can't serve this government anymore. Miłosz had been a diplomat in Washington, D.C. and in New York for the Polish Communist government for a few years, and he just quit. And when he renounced the thing, they thought he was going to be assassinated in the manner of Saudi princes. And so he holed up in that room for months in Chomsky's room until they figured out how to protect it. So anyway, I knew, having worked on these poems, I knew about Katyn Woods, I knew some of that story. I was amazed at the way you mastered those materials and the way that you tell the story in the book, but I'm wondering about, and like you, I began with the prejudice that Poles were anti-Semites. So how did you come to the story of Katyn Woods?
Well, when you look into Chomsky's life, if in this 21st century reflex you Google somebody, you get Chomsky's name, and the next word is almost invariably Katyn.
Yeah.
And I didn't know about this man. I knew about it vaguely. I didn't know the details of it, but in the world in which I grew up, in which my father, who had been a prisoner of war, and an American airman who was shot down over Germany and a prisoner of war, the world in which I grew up, a lot was not spoken about these kinds of things. And in addition, 6 million Jews were killed. Whatever side you want to take, or whatever numbers or statistics, it was bad for everybody. But on such a vast scale that the murder of 22,000 Polish officers seems like a drop in the bucket. And that was what the Soviets were actually counting on. And so I did not know the details of it. And so when I began to learn it, the documentation that came out of the Soviet archives, the Soviets are amazing record keepers. Nothing was lost. So everything was there in full detail. Every name of every prisoner that was killed, who killed him, what time, what day, all of that became available in 1990. So I come along in 2012, and all of these Russian historians have taken this material. And people who are still alive, who survived, in addition to Chomsky, begin writing memoirs, and there's an enormous amount of history that ties into the politics in Poland today that goes back to where you were and what position you took. Because if you said in Poland during the Soviet years, from 1945 from 1990, if you suggested in any way that these men were killed in 1940, you could be arrested. Because if they died in 1940, it meant the Soviets had killed them. The Soviet line was that they were killed in 1941 when the Germans had come back and reclaimed this land. So the Soviets forged papers and put them on the bodies that had been disinterred of the men that were killed to prove that they were there in 1941, alive, but they were not.
Incredible story, just an incredible story. And of course that was part of Miłosz's defection, is that not being, how could you know, it was a lie that could not be supported.
Yes.
So when so he served in World War I, because he was born in 1896, and then in 1819 he transforms himself into a young art student, and then goes to Paris. And what's the name of the woman he met in Paris? Who?
You think of Misha Sert?
Yeah.
So Misha Sert was a woman who was kind of the doyenne of the Paris cultural scene in the 20s. To give you an idea, her best friends were Diaghilev and Coco Chanel. She had an amazing salon in which everybody came to, painters, writers, musicians. She herself had studied with Fauré, and Liszt was a friend of her grandfather's. She was an amazing woman, and she encouraged artists as much as she could. She lived a very high style, and she published the first pages of Proust as a young man in her husband's journal, literary journal, called La Revue Blanche, which her husband had founded with her money. And so she knew Proust from the very beginning. She knew everybody. Proust, she appears as a character in Proust's novel. She met with Chomsky at one point because, as I said, they raised money for 6 weeks, but they stayed 7 years. She helped them do fundraisers in Paris, and she just said, okay, come tomorrow and we'll talk to Picasso. So Picasso came over for lunch, and they decided that he would help support them.
So it's interesting to me that it was Fauve, it was Matisse and Bonnard, who were, especially Bonnard, who were first just for Chomsky or for that whole group?
For the whole group, I think everybody in Poland who decided they wanted to see French painting, everyone found their own path. But Bonnard was a particular interest because Bonnard painted with a man named Józef Pankiewicz, who was Chomsky's teacher. This was a Pole who had preceded them to Paris. And so Pankiewicz knew Bonnard very well and introduced him to this group of young painters. So they watched him paint, they saw him, they knew him. But more importantly, they loved what he was doing. And unlike other Polish painting in the past, they felt that color was the key to painting. And Bonnard was their mentor in that way.
Yeah. So did you think that work just looked fabulous? Was it when you started working on this? Was there a place you could go and see a lot of Chomsky, or?
No, not as a member of the public, because the Polish museums have his work, but they keep it in storage. The whole idea of who's an important Polish painter is still being deliberated because of the influence of politics. Chomsky, for all the years that Poland was a Soviet satellite, Chomsky was an enemy of the state. So you couldn't own his paintings, you couldn't see his paintings. All of that has changed since the end, but since the end of communism. But the Poles now are very interested in what's happening next, and looking back on Chomsky is kind of retroactive to a certain degree. But now that there's a biography in America about Chomsky, maybe that will change a little bit more. So I had to go to find these paintings by and large. I met family members who had them in closets that they would pull out and dust off and say, oh, I haven't seen this in years. Most people bought his paintings because they felt that he was a man of enormous integrity, that he was a great man. They didn't buy them because they loved the paintings. Essentially, they were trying to help him. People didn't really look at his paintings seriously. But there was one man who, in the late 1970s, opened a gallery in Switzerland almost exclusively to show Chomsky's work. He thought Chomsky was a wonderful painter. He thought Chomsky's a man who's in his 80s now, who needs an income. And every year for 15 years, this man gave him a show and sold many of his paintings. What he didn't tell Chomsky was that he was the one who was buying many of them. So at the end of the day, he had 250 paintings by Chomsky. He essentially was able to skim the cream in a certain way, buy the best ones. He sold many to other people, but this was the collection that I went to see in Switzerland that convinced me that, oh, there really is something here.
And where was that collection? Was it in storage? Was it on the walls?
It was in a small house in a very small town on the banks of Lake Geneva, about an hour from Lausanne. It was, at one point, had been operating as a commercial gallery, but when Chomsky died, the man felt no longer the need to keep it running. But he essentially had the estate of Chomsky, and he makes it available for whomever wants to show it, or in my case, to write about it.
And is it the case that all of Chomsky's work from before 1939 was destroyed in the destruction of
Yes.
Warsaw?
This is Chomsky painted, as you saw. He started painting in the 1920s, and everything that he also, from the time he was 14, he kept a journal, a diary, which was always also a sketchbook for him. And so he had hundreds of diaries from his childhood and hundreds of paintings. And on September 2nd, when he went to war, he put all of those in storage in Warsaw. safely wrapped, assuming that he would come back to them, little knowing that Warsaw would be destroyed by the Nazis in 1944 in the uprising. So all of that childhood and early manhood work from up until this is 1939, he was already 43 in the Second World War. So everything he did until up to time he was 43 is gone. There are very few examples that other people have bought his paintings that they subsequently gave to the museum in Poland. So there are some examples, and they're very, very good paintings.
Just one amazing part of the story that you didn't touch on was in that journey from the Gulag, or the concentration camp where the Polish officers were, that took him to Persia, and then to Cairo, and then to this famous battle at Monte Cassino. On that trip through Russia, he was appointed by Anders to figure out where the hell these other officers, the 20,000 officers, had disappeared.
Yeah. Should I read a little something?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll set it up.
Let me just say before you set up a reading, when Eric was working on this book, I thought, well, it's interesting, he knows a lot about painting. Boy, is this a complicated story. And I just want to say, of the two reviews that have appeared so far of this book, one in the New York Review of Books and one Times Literary Supplement, they both talk about how beautifully written the book is and how masterful this retelling of the complex story of the politics of the 20th century is. So, let's hear you.
I want to say I appreciate that. It's an amazing story. That is not known that well. So it was, I won't say it was easy to put together, but it's an incredible story. So the setup is, Chapsky is appointed by General Anders to go and find, this is 1941, the men have been dead for over a year. The Soviets have never acknowledged it, and the new Polish army that's being formed when Hitler attacks Russia needs leadership. And they're saying, okay, where are your men? And nobody's coming forward. From all over the huge map of Russia, there are these camps, and labor camps, and prison camps. And all the Poles are finally released, not all of them, but many of them are, enough to make an army. And they all come to this one central point in Kazakhstan, where they are being made into several divisions that can go and fight Hitler. And none of the leaders come. All of the men that Chapsky was in camp with in Starobielsk, where are they? Nobody knows. So Anders assigns Chapsky, again, he's a non-combatant. This is person that he can take this and make a contribution to the army. Anders writes on letters to all the heads of the major centers in Russia to help them find these men. And he writes letters on very, very beautiful English woven stationery with the eagle of Poland embossed on the top. In Soviet Russia, paper of this quality is unheard of. So Chapsky would appear at the mission and present this paper, and people would kind of, right away, sir, So he is sent by Anders to find out where these men are. And you know what? I'm going to read Chapsky's version rather than mine. This is, of the two books that I wrote on Chapsky, this is Chapsky's own memoir of these years in Russia. It's called In Human Land, and it's been published simultaneously with my biography and my Proust lectures, and I think it will give you a better sense of him hearing this from his voice. Apart from the difficulty of obtaining permission to enter Moscow, apart from the railroad lines being overloaded with military convoys and all the stations being packed with evacuees and refugees from the West, It was the season of the most extreme frosts and heavy snowfall. The tracks were buried and the trains were at a standstill for many days on end. My train was supposed to leave at night. To be on the safe side, I took my baggage to the station and left it in the vast waiting room, behind the thin wooden partition where our embassy had its operational desk. There was a soldier sitting there, in a space barely large enough for a table and 2 chairs. This was where the officers in charge of all the Polish convoys arriving from the north came to report, and where they were also issued ration cards with bread and canned food. I spent 3 days and nights waiting for that train, which was due to set off at any moment. I spent the days at the embassy or at the hotel, and the nights sitting in this huge waiting room. The temperature in the city was approaching 45 degrees below zero. Every time it looked as if the train might have had a chance of moving, I was summoned by our post to come. Then I would race a mile or so to the station. I have no memory of feeling the cold too acutely. There wasn't a breath of wind. I just had to be careful not to let my nose or ears get frostbitten. As for those nights at the station, the way into it was through a large square cluttered with trucks. Then you had to go around a wooden fence and slither along a steep, icy path that led to the large waiting room. Here, you had to squeeze past long lines of people waiting for tickets, not for hours, but for days. Depending on their function or the kind of travel documents they had, they waited many days. Then you had to walk or rather hop across the large room. The entire floor was littered with hundreds of people in an extremely emaciated state, waiting goodness knows how many days for transport. In the greenish, foggy, sticky light of weak bulbs, in the air full of damp from steaming bodies and wet, tattered clothing, the main thing on view were the unnaturally vast, full-length portraits of Lenin, Stalin, and other leaders. On the floor lay the thin stumps of legs, miserable, puffy faces, and heaps of ragged human figures in padded jackets over their naked chests. The entire waiting room was filled with the roar of a superb radio. A brilliant orchestra, broadcast from Moscow, was playing Strauss waltzes with truly Viennese panache. Meanwhile, screaming and quarreling kept erupting into the waiting room, the howling of a woman who may have been robbed or who may have been a lunatic. On one of these nights, I saw some trucks crossing the station square that were loaded, as if with timber, with the corpses of people who had frozen to death in the trains, now being driven off for burial. These were the corpses of people who, following their release from the labor camps at the time of the German attack on Moscow, had been forced to travel for weeks with hardly any clothing, quite often in open rail cars, on trains that stood for days at a time on snow-covered tracks in cruel frosts.
Wow.
So I think we should open up for questions for Eric.
Yes.
How is it that he lived the last 50 years of his life in that room?
Can you hear in the back?
I don't know.
So you have to restate the question.
I just wondered about his choice to live out the last 50 years of his life alone in that room without a family. Can you explain that?
He actually had his sister lived upstairs in a room in that house, so he did have family. But the house itself, the entire house, was considered by many people of the sovereignty of Maison Lafitte, they called it. It was Poland. It was Polish earth in Paris.
But he didn't marry. That's what I mean. He didn't create his own family and just live a more normal life that way.
A normal life was not something Chapsky ever aspired to.
Right.
He had relationships both with men and women, and he never married because he always wanted to be able to be a painter first. That was his dedication. And he knew, because he had gone from a very privileged childhood, in which everything possible a child could want was available to him, to being a penniless painter who knew that he could not really give children what they might want. And it was a decision that he made, and I think lived with quite easily. He had enormously close friendships with many people, and as he aged in the Paris years, everybody knew Chapsky. Everybody really wanted to get to know him. People from Poland came to Paris when they could get out of Poland, and the first place they would go would be to Maison Lafitte and ask to meet Chapsky. The rest of the house, it should not be forgotten, was full of these other brilliant Polish writers and critics who created this journal called Kultura, which was one of the great journalistic accomplishments of the 20th century. And people were always coming to speak to the editors. They would come downstairs, they would do their business with Jerzy Giedrich was the man who was the main editor. They would do their business with him. They would leave by the front door, then they would go around to the back of the house, go up the back steps, and find Chapsky.
What language were his notebooks written in?
The question is, what language were his notebooks written in? And they were written in French, Polish, German, and Russian. In the same paragraph, he would quote, when he would remember something, he would write it down in his journal in whatever language he had read it in originally. His journals are full of newspaper clippings in several languages. They're full of drawings he does made in museums with his own notations about colors in different languages. So he was really, this was a world in which people spoke easily, readily many languages. And the Poles to this day understand that their language is difficult and that they do not expect that foreigners will speak Polish. He spoke, and he could quote. The fact that he could summon Proust in French, to me, is just an amazing accomplishment.
Well, the implication is that all the officers to whom he gave these lectures also knew French.
All the officers essentially were of the class that he had grown up in. All of them had been massively well educated. All of them were cosmopolitan. All of them were not open-minded necessarily, but all of them had been exposed through intermarriage of this aristocratic class to the Baltic states, to Austria-Hungary, to every European country could be represented. So they did all speak many languages, and those that came would have readily understood. And he in his talks he refers to Racine. So I mean, it's not even speaking the language; it's mastering the history of its cultural patrimony of different countries.
Did you have access to these journals in their raw form?
I would repeat the question. Oh, did I have access to the journals in their raw form? And I had the great privilege, I think I would probably be one of the last people who studies Chapsky who will actually have been able to touch the pages. In the 6.5 years I've done this research, 39,422 pages have been digitized. So they are now all available. You can't touch them anymore. But as a painter, to flip through these pages and come across these drawings, it was just incredible. And the drawings, the first journals that they have are from 1942, from the time he left the prison camp. Somehow he managed to get some of those journals out of Soviet Russia with him, and they go all the way to 1993. And at the very end, it's a tremendously moving experience because at first he's a young man, who's just drawing, and then he becomes once again a painter, and the drawings refer to his paintings. And then at the very end of his life, in his late 80s, when he's doing some of his best painting, he begins to go blind, and his sight leaves him, and yet not completely. So there are moments when he can see very well. So when he can't, in this little room, in his studio, he put his paints in envelopes, and in this childlike scrawl, he would write with color. So this envelope was yellow, this was cadmium green, and that's how he could see where he could barely really see, and he put the paint on the tube and he would paint it. And then what I'm getting to is the fact that when he could no longer paint, he still had his journals. And in the last few years, you see that he would do still lifes, or he would do self-portraits, whatever he could barely make out. And you got the sense that he couldn't see, but the brush or the pen was doing the scene for him. And at the very end, he was just actually really making lines, because he wanted that contact with the page, but there was no image.
You said that before you began this work, it was important to you to know if Chomsky was anti-Semitic. How did you discover that he wasn't?
Did everyone hear that? No. The question was, how did I discover that Chomsky was not anti-Semitic? In several ways. People I spoke to who were very curious that I, as an American Jew and a painter, was interested in this Polish man who potentially could have been anti-Semitic. People assured me that he was really a man who was revered for his integrity and his lack of small-mindedness in this subject. But what really convinced me was a memoir that was written by a Jewish officer, Polish officer, who had been in the camps with him, who talked about how forthright he was and how he was somebody that anybody could trust. And he often made an effort to connect with the Jews in the camp because they were being so badly treated in this camp by their fellow officers. So the extent to which this anti-Semitism was so deep was that there would be fights in the prison camp between Poles and Jews. So this memoir was very moving about it. The fellow who wrote the memoir talks about Chomsky. He had a photograph of himself with his brothers and sisters, and he said it was like a menorah, that each of them was like a candle.
There have been compilations and exhibitions of Gertrude Stein's collection. Does anyone know the provenance of the art that she bought, and is there any other art extant from the early periods when he was painting?
This is a question about Gertrude Stein having bought a painting by Chomsky and whether or not we can trace it. Gertrude Stein bought so much work that this is not a work that, because Chomsky has no name, people want to see the Picassos and Matisses, and understandably the Stein's collection here in San Francisco that we know about. His work does not figure in it. There's a provenance number for it in the archive, but there's no record of where the painting is now, so I don't even know which painting it was, because it is just a number, not a title. But there is a record both in his journals and in correspondence at the Weinicke Library between Stein and Chomsky, the postcards they wrote about each other, about her purchases. And he acted as the what's the word? Sales agent for the group of 12 artists in Poland. He was the one who did everything because his French was so fluent. Now, unlike the officer class, these other painters he went to Paris with were from all walks of life and not nearly as well educated as he. And he was completely comfortable and fluent in French, so when they were in Paris, he did everything for them. He signed the contracts for where they have their studios. He took care of them when they had to go to the doctors. He did everything. So he did all of the sales, and that's how we happen to have this correspondence with Gertrude Stein.
Are there any of Chomsky's paintings in American collections and museums?
There are no Chomsky paintings in American collections, or in museums. There are in collections. There's a woman in San Francisco who has about 8 paintings by Chomsky. Her mother was Chomsky's housekeeper in Maison Lafitte. So essentially, really, a peasant woman. This is her daughter, who is now here in San Francisco, very well educated, quite wonderful, who has no idea. She keeps the paintings because they're sentimental. Her mother, Chomsky gave them to her, and she gave them to her daughter.
Eric, why wasn't he recognized as a painter when he was in Paris for all of those years?
The question is, why wasn't he recognized as a painter in Paris for all those years? Really, this is a crucial part of my interest in him, because he was a completely devoted representational painter at a time when the manifest destiny of painting turned towards non-representational abstraction. So it was even considered reactionary to paint from life. And he insisted that was his means of mode of expression, was to see something and then record it, either usually as a sketch, which then would become a painting. And that kind of painting was of no interest to anybody in Paris at the time. Really, Chomsky was not alone, certainly. But when he was 84, when he was 88, in 1984, somebody sent him a book of Milton Avery paintings. And he felt that Avery had done exactly what he had hoped to do, which was he called squaring the circle of abstraction. It was painting from life, but letting the abstract qualities of paint dominate. So he never saw an Avery painting, but he recognized from this book of reproductions how important Avery was.
Can you say just a little more about your interest in him as a painter, kind of following up from that, Kathy's question? And you said, well, that's part of why I found him so interesting as a painter. And when you talked about him just at the end of the conversation with Bob, there's something that happened even just to your voice. When you talk about the lines on the paper and the brushes, can you just talk a little bit about that part of your journey with him?
Well, the question is, can I talk about why I get choked up when I talk about his work? These pages at the end of his journal the last few years are, again, so moving. He couldn't really see. And you have that feeling of all of his creative energy being channeled through his hand, shaking. And they're beautiful drawings. I mean, the irony, of course, is that these drawings of lines are pure abstraction. He's not drawing anything because he can't see anything. But it's the journey. It's at the end of his life. It's just actually the diminution of his flame that was very prolonged. He died in his 97th year, and the last 3 or 4 years he was housebound. He couldn't see well. And he had a lot of attention. All of his meals were made for him by this housekeeper, who fed everybody in the group. But it's terrifically moving to see those and to turn the page. It's like coming to the end of a book, but it's a book with 34,000 pages. This diary. But when you get to the end of the last few years, you just turn. There are many blank pages which never existed before. But you could feel him reaching for his diary and trying to find a blank page and grabbing a pen. I also had an experience when I was reading his Chapsky lectures in this 14th century library in Krakow, where they would bring the boxes out to me of these typescripts in which I told you that the lectures were given to these two men who wrote them down. At some point, the written manuscripts were turned into typewritten manuscripts. And then, so the 2 copies were what I used for my translation of this book. Because there were 2 of them, I made sure I knew each of them to see if there were any variations, because they were each done by a different man. And after having gone there several times over several years to look at them, the last time I went to this museum, and they brought you, somebody in white gloves has this box, and you take them out. And this last time I went, they were upside down in the folders. And I had to turn them upright, but as I was about to do that, I saw on the bottom, on the top of the page, which is usually the bottom of the stack, I saw that there was a drawing. It was clearly Chapsky's drawing in his hand, and it was of a dog, and a happy dog sitting in profile. A very, very sweet drawing, and his diaries are full of hundreds of these drawings. But I knew instantly that he must have been somewhere where he needed paper. He was always reaching for something, and he didn't have a sketchbook, but he had a pen, and he grabs this piece of paper in his room, and it turns out that it's the last page of his lecture on Proust, in which he's talking about Proust's death. And so I don't think he knew it when he did it. I don't know if he would have done that, but he just drew the thing. The dog who was sitting there in front of him obviously took off and went somewhere else. And Chapsky had this drawing of the dog, and then whether he turned it over or not and realized that it was the end of the Proust lectures or not. But it was so moving to me that impulse to draw was so clearly felt in this one single sheet of paper that informed so much of my relationship to his work on paper that it was so spontaneous.
Do you have a sense of the source of his courage and integrity and strength of character. You didn't mention anything about religious convictions, and but I just wonder if you can address that.
So the question is about his if he had religious convictions. It's a very good question, and I'm glad you asked it, because there's so much to talk about Chomsky. Sometimes you lose a major part of him, just goes by the wayside. And his spiritual life was extremely strong and a huge source of strength to him. He believed in God. He was a Catholic. He was not a conventional Catholic by any means, in that he didn't necessarily go to Mass regularly. Poles are notorious for going to Mass and calling themselves Catholics. Over 85% of Poles today identify as Catholic and go to Mass weekly. I mean, that's an incredible statistic. But he took God very seriously and had a very personal relationship with God, I think, with his idea of God. And I think that was an enormous source of strength for him. His ability to understand suffering was really the key to his relationship. That he saw others in pain, and he felt a responsibility to share that pain. He was enormously involved with the work of Simone Weil, who, I don't know if you know her work, but she was a young French woman who was born Jewish and she was a brilliant woman. She read the Old Testament in Greek as a high school student. Simone Weil was in a class at the Sorbonne in Paris, in which she was the first in her class. The second in her class was Simone de Beauvoir, and the third in her class was Jean-Paul Sartre. So she was a smart cookie, but she was somebody who identified always with the pain in the world and suffering in the world. And she went to work in a Renault automobile factory because she felt as a bourgeois, she had no idea of the real reality. And she wrote beautifully about faith. And Chomsky read her books when they came out in 1945 after the war. She died in 1943, essentially of starvation, because she felt other people couldn't eat and she wouldn't eat. And she was a part mystic and part political animal. But Chomsky read her work and was very touched by it and struggled with her work all the time, because her great feeling was that in order to be devout or to be close to God, you have to be attentive. You have to be ready to receive the grace of God. And in order to receive the grace of God, you have to have emptied yourself. And she felt that the imagination and the creative life filled that space wrongly that should be given to God. And so he struggled. And it kept him on his feet. He struggled, and it convinced him further and further that he should be an artist. But he had to always reconcile it with her idea of how you get to God.
Given Chomsky's connection or affinity to Proust's writing, did Chomsky in those early days in Paris ever cross paths in person with Proust?
Chomsky arrived in Paris in 1924 with these other painters, and he of course died in 1922. But he knew many people at that point who knew Chomsky very well, including this Daniel Halévy, who was in the painting by Degas that I showed you, the young boy. About that time when that painting was made, Halévy and Proust were schoolmates. And Proust wrote a very salacious letter to him and wrote a poem addressed to Halévy, which essentially talked about his sweet limbs. And he wrote him a very outrageous come-on letter. I mean, they were 16 and 17. But Halévy became very close to Chomsky. There was 30 years between them. And Chomsky had access to all of this Proustian material through Halévy. So they never were able to cross paths.
So I
We
think
should
we only
maybe
have
one
time.
more question.
Yeah, one more question.
Was the family fortune ever to be retrieved at all?
Well, the question was the family fortune ever retrieved? And the answer is no. to this day, it's still, I wouldn't worry terribly much about the family though, because their money came from many places. The great nieces and nephews, by and large, have done very well in terms of reclaiming lands and fortunes that were theirs. But that house was destroyed by the Soviets that I showed you of his childhood.
So there are 4 books, paintings by Proust, paintings in Proust, almost nothing, Eric's biography, lectures on Proust, Eric's translation of those, and then the translation of Chomsky's memoir In Human Land. And it's the Christmas season, everybody had all 4 of the books, and this amazing bookstore should be supported. Very amazing. Thank you so much.